The 3 R's are more important.
4 R's
The 4 R's now are more important.
Yes.
How's the battle been so far? Has the battle been pretty good? That's right. It ain't one of these battles where anybody gets hurt. It's a battle where there's no losers, only winners and learners. Let's call up the next winner, Brother Basir Mchawi. It's 10 minutes summation. 10 minutes. And rebuttal.
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, we're much in agreement. I started talking about African-centeredness, and then Professor Williams did the same. But what I want to do in terms of putting this whole struggle in terms of education, putting it in some context, let's look at the United States, where it stands in education. And if it's bad for white folks in the United States, imagine how bad it is for us. U.S. students slide in global ranking on math, reading, and science. This is from NPR, December 3rd, 2013. American 15-year-olds continue to turn in flat results in a test that measures students' proficiency in reading, math, and science worldwide, failing to crack the global top 20. The Program for International Student Assessment collects test results from 65 countries for its rankings, which come out every 3 years. The latest results from 2012 show that U.S. students rank below average in math among the world's most developed countries. They were close to average in science and reading. In mathematics, 29 nations and other jurisdictions outperformed the United States by a statistically significant margin. In science, 22 education systems scored above the U.S. average. In reading, 19 other locales scored higher than U.S. students. The top overall scores came from Shanghai, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Macau, and Japan, followed by Liechtenstein, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Estonia. The math scores of students in Shanghai showed that they are the equivalent of over 2 years of formal schooling ahead of those observed in Massachusetts, itself a strong performing U.S. state. So we're not even in the top 20 as a nation. And if there's an achievement gap, where do we as a people end up? This is a crisis. It's obviously a national crisis, but for us, it's a national crisis. Because we as nationalists talk about we need to be a nation, we need to be striving towards nationhood, and we do. So this is a question that we have to address. What can we do? First, number one, we have to continue the struggle for community control of schools. 1968, Ocean Hill, Brownsville. That's what it was then. That's what it is now. We, the community, needs to control its schools. Second, we need to defeat charter schools, especially as implemented in New York State. Why? Because all charter schools do is take public dollars, your tax dollars, and gives it to white folks so that they can educate our children, which in charter schools they do not do successfully. Now in other states, some charter schools are a little different. In New Jersey, we have charter schools that are operated by African people. In Illinois, we have charter schools that are operated by African people. In New York City, no. They got this woman, Evil Moskowitz. Okay? She has more charter schools than anybody else, and then guess what she did? She got her husband to go ahead and create a charter school company. And now he's second. Evil Moskowitz used to be the head of the City Council Education Committee, and then went and started developing charter schools. Does that sound like conflict of interest? But we don't question that. And then when, Michael Bloomberg decided to go ahead and give all this money away, Michael Bloomberg's daughter has a charter school, as I understand. All right? Now, these people need to be taken away in handcuffs somewhere. But what are they doing? They're coming into our communities, going ahead, running amok in regards to miseducating our children. We have to fund and support our own institutions, including volunteering. If you don't have the money, make the time. We have to go back to creating our own institutions. We need to engage with our young people on a regular basis. Young people think that old people are afraid of them. You know, young people step to me sometimes, they look a little strange, and I say, listen, don't get it twisted. Yeah. Don't get it twisted. Because this is one slightly getting a little bit old here that you don't want to make that mistake. All right? So we don't need to be afraid of the young people. The reason why our young people act like they do is because of the process of miseducation that they undergo on a regular basis. If they weren't miseducated, do you think they would act the way that they act? Who's going to address it? Who's going to address it?
We are.
Some people are not sure. You know, only we can address this issue. There's nobody else going to address the issue for us. We have to do that. We have to make Africana studies, black studies departments accountable to the community. What has happened in regards to departments around the country is that they have moved away from having relationships with the community. When they have relationships with the community, they can't do some of the stupid and crazy stuff that they do. So there needs to be that linkage. There needs to be an organic connection to the community. It's not like we got an Africana studies program at City College up on the hill away from Harlem. It has to be connected to Harlem. If it's not connected, it doesn't need to exist. We don't care if it's not a department or a program. Let's start somewhere else. Let's go down the hill and start our own institution to address these particular issues. Finally, Brother D, in terms of his hip-hop classic, took the slogan, which is fine with us, from the Black News: agitate, educate, organize. That's what we have to do. We have to continue on agitating, educating, organizing. And the time, obviously, is now. We have to go ahead and bring these young people into the fold more, because we're getting older. You know, there's no question about it. And over the last 2-3 years, in terms of all the giants that we have lost, it's clearer. So the time is now that we have to address these issues. We have to come together. And just based upon what we've been doing here at Clarke House since February 1st, we've got the tools. We've got the resources. We are the answer. The answer is nowhere else. Just look at yourself. Get up in the mirror every day, look at yourself, and tell yourself, I am the answer. Sante Sana.
Hotep family. So I'm going to start, I think I'm going to start with where Brother Basir left off. In terms of the imperative for us to be very serious about organization and institution building and returning Black Studies to its founding principles as an insurgent movement. And we should be clear that there needs to be a lot of struggle over that, because just as many other things we find, people are now being trained outside of that process. And to think it's basically just like any other academic discipline where you're just going to go through that and you learn some stuff, and if you do fairly well, you get paid. And I can tell you for sure on the graduate level and in terms of the people they are hiring, it is trending toward that. to the people who see what we do as not something designed to fundamentally strengthen the black community, fundamentally strengthen black institutions, fundamentally give students the tools they need to be very conscious institution builders and nation builders, but to instead get people who get caught up in what Dr. Jeffries likes to call the paralysis of analysis. Meaning you're so good at doing analysis and doing your research and breaking things down to, to the tiniest little atom and covering all the bases, but it doesn't lead you anywhere. And that's intentional. A lot of that stuff is not meant to lead you anywhere. Because, family, that's the type of work that's safe to do. You can criticize anything you want as long as you don't lead people toward, well, what might you do to actually get you out of this jam that you've been put in? And that's real. So Black Studies is very much facing both an internal and external crises, and we need to deal with that seriously. Some of the internal crises I've just talked about and mentioned, and that's something that we have to grapple with, and there aren't very many easy solutions for that. So I won't pretend that there are. External stuff is a little bit more complicated, but even so, we see where it's coming from. We see it right in the institution that I teach in, and I'm an alma mater of, the City University of New York. And they just pushed through a big initiative that they call Pathways, and it's not worth going into that in detail. If you want both sides of the story, you can very easily go up and Google it, and it'll come up. But it's essentially meant to streamline, or at least how it was sold, was to streamline the transfer process. Basically make it, logistically make it much easier for community college students to get their credits recognized when they transfer to a senior college. Now, of course, all of that leaves out a decade of university policy of pushing students who aspire to get four-year degrees into community colleges in the first place, which if you weren't doing, you wouldn't have that problem. But to bring us back to Black Studies and what we're talking about now, one of the things that it does is it very much simplifies the type of courses you can offer and tries to force them into a very narrow range. Now that's, the other thing it does is it cuts down on the amount of electives you can take. So you might say, well, that's necessarily a good thing, but then it goes back to some of the very foundations of education. Are you going to simply train people, or are you going to educate them? That has a profound influence on what we're considering here today. And I would actually argue it has a profound influence on what you're actually teaching students to do and how you're going to teach them to deal with the changing economy and the changing world. Because the fact is, I can't tell students what the world is going to be like in terms of labor and in terms of what they're doing 10 years from now. What I can do is teach them how to very critically understand things and how to not just carry out tasks, which is training. As Malcolm X famously said, you can train a dog, and the dog can do all sorts of stuff. Dog can roll over, play dead, get you your slippers, do all sorts of tricks. That dog ain't going to be educated. That dog ain't going to be trained to run anything. That dog's not going to be trained to do anything other than what you taught that dog to do. But the dog can go to school and come back with a certificate. So we need to think about that, because some of these things that are done supposedly in the interest of students are actually going against their best interests. The only defense of students now is to teach them to very critically be able to break apart the world and understand it on something other than a superficial level, which just trains you and doesn't educate you. And I would definitely not argue against the so-called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics disciplines, but a lot of what we have, even in CUNY, is training. So you have students getting very high-tech, very advanced, basically technical degrees. So they understand the stuff at a very basic level, but they may not necessarily understand how to run something. They certainly won't understand how to run a nation, much less a company, or even start their own company, or even get into government, or be able to run a government, or organize a government, because they ain't trained to do that. They're just trained to do the basic technical stuff you need to keep things running, but not to be able to manage stuff on a higher level. And that's part of the difference we're talking about, and that's one of the things that education at its basic level done right, and what Black Studies tries to do. It teaches, it not just trains you in terms of very specific technical things that you need to do to function in the day-to-day world and be a productive member of society, but it also teaches you to operate at a higher level and understand what you need to do to actually run things and control things, and be able to move toward a sense of self-determination. When you get to that point, family, you don't need people telling you what to do. You're going to figure it out.
All right.
Particularly if what you need to do tells you that what they're doing to your people is not in their best interest. And I think that's probably a good place to wrap up. We need to think about this very critically. We need to understand that there is still a battle on. The war for Black studies, and I should add Puerto Rican studies and other areas of study, is far from won. Many of the things we think that we won, and as a matter of fact, a lot of our elders did win, is being clawed back as we speak. The class that Sister Betty talked about earlier, that I brought here earlier this week, as a matter of fact, I have two of my scholars back there right now, hiding in the next to last row. That's a class my department chair has had to fight with the university tooth and nail to keep running. And they claim it's too expensive because the enrollment is too low. But we also know of other classes in the classics and other areas with similarly low enrollment that don't seem to have that problem. So we need to critically ask, what that is, family. Whether that's actually the reason, or there's some other things behind it coloring what they're saying.
Brothers and sisters, let's hear it for our scholars. You can see they both came here prepared, and they both came here giving their all on the issue. At the same time, they didn't tear each other down. I think that the things they said were pretty much complimentary. But I don't know if you all saw it that way. What we've done is we've brought in two people who can wrap things up for us and give us a kind of a rundown. But before we get to them, we're going to have a question and answer period. Anybody who has a question, we'd like you to come right over here to this doorway here. And our two speakers, we'd like you to come back up and field questions from the floor. Yes, sir. Just go ahead and use Dr. J. Yes.
You mentioned that
I believe the cameras, yes, he's done.
Can we start on the house?
You mentioned that you are no longer teaching Black and Latino students in college, and that you've seen a precipitous decrease over time. Why do you think that is? What's happening specifically to cause that change?
Well, if you recall, when Michael Bloomberg became the mayor, he said, I'm going to be the education mayor. And I need to be judged on what I do in the field of education. Since Michael Bloomberg became the mayor, the educational system in New York City, public education, it's totally in chaos. That the young people who are being produced by this city system are worse than those that were produced prior to Bloomberg becoming the mayor. Now, he was mayor for 3 terms, so that's 12 years.
That's right.
And as I said earlier, one of the things that our now wonderful liberal mayor, with son with the afro, Mayor de Blasio, he went to Albany to try to get permanent mayoral control of the schools. So they just want to institutionalize it and make it continually worse where they're in charge and we just suffer.
So you're saying it's not So you're saying it's not incompetence, it's maliciousness or evil.
Listen,
I mean,
you have to really look at it for itself. When a system like this goes ahead, first of all, when white people become in charge of an educational system and it fails children of color, it's doing what it's supposed to do. Because that's what they're designing it to do. So we need to understand that. The system is not failing in regards to doing what it's supposed to do. It's doing what it's supposed to do. The problem is that very often we don't get it. You know, parents out here, they're just struggling trying to get, waiting for the school bus to come to put their child on the school bus so they can go ahead and go to work. They're not thinking really about that. And what has happened also, if you remember, parents have been taken totally out of schools. You go to school and who are you going to see first? A security guard or a police officer. And they're going to ask you, why are you there? What do you want? What do I want? I want a good education for my child. That's what I want. Now you get out the way. But this is what is happening.
I think Brother Basir covered that well, but I'll say, we have to deal with that on the higher education level as well. One of the places I teach is Hunter College, and maybe 3 years ago they, went through this radical change in terms of the security, of the campus. Even though there were really no, there essentially is no crime, or at least very little crime on college campuses to begin with, believe it or not. Even in the middle of New York City, particularly Hunter. And to be fair, they had some issues of a lot of homeless people coming in. But in terms of what you would think of as crime, it was essentially non-existent. And the campus was what they call an open campus, meaning the buildings were open, people could come and go as they wished. And I'm thinking about 3 years ago, they spent an insane amount of money. I think $300 million, if I remember correctly. But it was millions of dollars in terms of putting in this new security system. So now, to get into any of the campus buildings, you essentially have to go through something that looks like you're swiping into the subway. So there are turnstiles at every single entrance, and you have to swipe in. It's been an issue for me bringing guests to my classes. I mean, people from the community. If they're not already affiliated with the university system, it used to be just a matter of you showed ID to the guard. At Hunter, you didn't even have to do that. You just went right in. And I had one sister, very distinguished art historian up in Harlem. They had her sitting downstairs and forced me to come down and get her. to bring her upstairs. So what I'm saying is, when you do stuff like that, you gotta wonder, exactly what's behind it, and also what effect that's going to have on the college community. If it's supposed to be a place, the idea is it's supposed to be a place of free exchange of ideas and learning and interchange of ideas. So if you begin to cut that flow off, you have some serious consequences in terms of what you're dealing with. Frankly, I think it's a very stupid thing to do just on a very basic policy level. There's a lot to be said for, an elder walking along who just decides to come in to get out of the cold or out of the heat or something like that. Well, how do you think that person is going to respond if they decide to cut funding, which they're going to do sometime in the future? If this is a place they can't even go in, well, I don't know. I've never gone to Hunter. I used to go in there all the time. I haven't been in there in 10 years. I don't know what the hell they're doing up there. So that's just one piece of it in terms of the management and misguided corporatized control of the university. There's similar things happening at other campuses. There are a couple campuses where even as a member of the university, you can't get into except to go to a library. Baruch and Hostos are like that. But the other piece is we've also seen a very systematic drop in black students, primarily in the so-called elite four-year schools in CUNY. And I don't really have time to fully get into that. Maybe we can talk later if somebody else has a follow-up question on it. But that has a seriously profound effect because, number one, well, aside from the community colleges, and we already know the differences in transferring from a 2-year to 4-year school, we don't exactly know where some of those students are going. A few of them are going elsewhere, maybe to SUNY schools, but I suspect a lot of them are not going anywhere at all, or maybe going to these technical colleges that are going to rip them off for 2 years, and if they're lucky, spit them out with a degree that isn't worth the paper it's printed on. So that's a serious issue we need to start tackling too.
I have a question for both of you. Sometimes I turn to Channel 5 just to see what the pundits are saying. And very often I hear them saying that you have Oprah Winfrey, who's a billionaire. You have Michael Gordon, or whatever, the basketball player, who's a trillionaire. And all of these wealthy black people. So what are you black people complaining about? There's no place else in the world where you could have black people being billionaires and millionaires. So it's your argument falls and fails because it has no substance. It's you are complaining because you are not aggressive enough or smart enough or intelligent enough to become a multimillionaire like the two individuals or a few individuals that I've just named. So I would like for both of you to speak to that issue and say why it is that black people have not attained much in this world because of their laziness.
Well, in terms of, two interesting examples, when you use Oprah and you use Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan is one, while he may be a great basketball player, fails as a human being. And he does so, I remember very, very graphically, when my, at the time, 80-year-old mother-in-law, with her union, was out demonstrating against Michael Jordan and Nike. And she was doing so because here it was, the unions were very, very clear that Nike was abroad, was paying people pennies to go ahead and make sneakers that they were charging here $100, $150, and now even more for. Michael Jordan had so much power at the time. Jordan's commercials. That he could have got whatever he wanted. If he said, I want the factories to go and be functioning at this particular level. I want the people to be paid like this. I do not want them to be exploited. It would have happened. But because he fails as a human being, he couldn't say that. With Oprah, one of the issues is with Selma, which is a whole discussion in and of itself to talk about that. Selma, a good movie. And I've said publicly, David Oyelowo needed to be nominated for Best Actor. Ava DuVernay needed to be nominated as Best Director. And lo and behold, something happened just the other day in terms of Ava DuVernay. She did a documentary on Venus Williams that is absolutely wonderful. It's wonderful. And it's interesting because I just, I'd seen it on ESPN and I got a hold of it and I looked at it and it said, directed by Ava DuVernay. Just like 2 days ago or something like that. I was like, wow, this is where she comes from. But when you look at the film Selma, there's some real serious issues in that. Historical ones. Why is SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, distorted, disrespected in this particular film? See, and people with the Oprah mindset, if you get everything else historically correct in the film, and then you get SNCC in its role wrong, it has to do with educational revisionism. The idea that we want to change the way the civil rights movement actually worked. Because we're not interested in the fact that it was the masses of people that were able to go ahead and determine their own destiny and change history. That it was supposed to be. It was Dr. King. It was SCLC. And that's not true. That's not the case. But what happens is, you look at these folks and you see why they get the money they get. They're being rewarded for what they do and the role that they play in our community. And it's, very often, if it's not directly destructive, it's clearly divisive. And we have to be careful. But we know that we as a people, we don't control. I can't say control. We have access to a gross national product of $1 trillion. African people in North America, $1 trillion. So that means that the mass of people, we have more money than Oprah. We have more money than Michael Jordan. But we can't think of it that way. And the other thing that we have difficulty with doing is going ahead and pooling our resources. We're here in an institution where people came together to pool their resources in order to get it. We could have owned, we talk about gentrification in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Harlem. We could have owned Bedford-Stuyvesant. We could have owned Harlem. And who do we have to blame? Us. Us. But what we have to do is, despite all of our errors, we have to go ahead and remember, victory is certain. We have to move forward. And we have to learn how to do these things. Garvey did it. When I was here February 1st talking about Garvey, pooling our resources. Garvey did it. If he could do it then, why can't we do it now?
No, hang it
A lot of that. But the one thing I'll say is you have to understand the basic difference between the individual and the institutional, and that's how they trap us. That's how they trip us up all the time, particularly in the news. You see it particularly around racism, and they'll talk. So they train you to think that you really have to worry about the one Klansman or something like that. And while I won't say you don't have to, by doing that, they take your eye off some of the big things that are going on that aren't even, and I'm not even talking conspiracy theory stuff. I'm simply just talking about institutions that are basically doing what they were set up to do, because a lot of them essentially work on inertia. That's why you set up an institution. So if you have institutions that were not set up in the interests of African people at the beginning of the country, or when they began, and they simply just continue the same way they were doing, even though you've had a few tweaks along the way. They're still fundamentally not going to be working in the interest of African people. That's a fairly basic thing. So to get back specifically to the question, you see a similar thing happening in terms of understandings of wealth and income. And granted, I'm not primarily a statistics and numbers guy. But one of the things you can always you always have to think about is when you can point to individuals, then that's a problem. And what we do know is that on average, Black and Latino wealth has been clobbered, for about the last 8 years. It has gone down precipitously under the Obama administration. Now, whether or not that'd be better or worse under anybody else is partially conjecture, and we'll never know. But we got to deal with the reality. The housing crisis has absolutely destroyed us, because that's where the average American has most of their wealth tied up in. So when you combine that with the predatory lending practices that targeted Black folk and Latinos, even people who were qualified to get the better loans and didn't, then you begin to see things happening on the institutional level in terms of wealth. We also know in terms of income. Anytime you go through a depression and or recession, the old last hired first fired thing comes to case. Also the people who tend to get hired last after things get better, and tend to get hired for less amounts of money. You have all that stuff going on too. Now having said all that, I think the way Brother Basir wrapped it up is important to keep in mind. The Garvey movement had one of the strongest and largest global organizations ever. And that's going back in the 1920s, when we certainly didn't have anywhere near the amount of wealth and income that we do now, even considering the seriously dire straits that we're in. So I think the flip side of that, is understanding that organizing and building strong institutions and strong organizations that can begin to deal with things on a structural level is about the only way that you're going to get ahead and get out of this jam and build power.
Last question. Last question.
Good afternoon. First thing I want to say is that both of y'all gave real powerful points of views that weren't particularly tied to your points of reference, but they were just so such a well of wealth connected to us in our struggle. And I want to say thank you to Beeper for having this. These debates have been marvelous. I've revisited the Civil War. I'm doing education today. I've gained from Harriet, John Brown. It's just been all across the board win-win for everybody. I think Carter G. Woodson said it best. If you educate a man to go to the back door, he'll do it every time. And where there is no back door, he'll cut out one for himself. You cannot expect the people who treat you wrong to teach you right. I think that was the point Brother Basir said. And I think you said through African eyes, then one will find his own path for himself as well as African people. I think the point that I want to bring out is that they're doing what they're designed to do, as both of you said. The schools aren't failing. Actually, they're progressing quite nicely. And I think you can see it all around you, particularly when you think of political correctness with the media. You know, another tool that they use to educate us, because now you can't even revolt against bad education. I'd just like to gain a possible solution, and I know you've offered some, but maybe a possible solution that we can start with today, tomorrow, shortly hereafter.
You know, something that people have been really reluctant to do for some time. The last boycotts we had of public education, 64, 65, we had Milton Galamison, who went ahead and organized a massive boycott of schools to go ahead and try to foster some integration and some quality for Black and Latino students. 68, we had the great boycott when folks went out in support of the struggle in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and 4 other communities around the city who were struggling for community control. We have to go back to that, because when children stay home, it represents big dollars for the Board of Education.
That's right.
And if you are able to go ahead and keep those folks home for a hot second, they got to listen to you, because you're hitting them very seriously in their pocket. There are a number of organizations that are currently doing some work around education. I mean, in terms of their contact information, I don't have it off the top of my head, but we can revisit that, because there are a few organizations that are trying to come forward organizing. There are folks who are organizing as teachers. There are folks who are organizing as parents. There are folks who are organizing as community people. They have alternative plans. They have a People's Board of Education, just kind of similar to what we have in terms of BPA, that they're looking to kind of roll out in regards across the city, so that people once again, the community once again, can begin to take control of the school system. So what I would like to do is transmit the contact information for a couple of education organizations that are currently doing good work to BPA, so that they can promulgate it and it can be available, that you can call, you can go to their websites, you can see what education information that they have and take advantage of that for now. But once it gets warm, once the springtime comes, you know, we have to see if we can organize so we can get out in the street a little bit. Because that's what these folks understand. And de Blasio, you know, with his liberal, you know, kind of
Yes.
persona, I guess we'll call it. You know, everybody's like, oh, you know, he's so nice. He got a black wife. He got some of the afro. I mean, you know, we don't want to mess with him too bad. But see what he's doing. See what's going on right now. You know, the police officers showed them they're behind, and he didn't know what to do. He was scared. And if you notice now, it's like he's trying to create some kind of peace with police, the police department, with NYPD. You
Is
know,
there a possibility that he will get complete control? Is there a possibility?
there's always a possibility. There's always a possibility. You know, there's always a possibility. If he went and he took it up to the legislature, since he's got this liberal persona, but at the same time doing things that the most conservative and backwards forces in Albany would want,
Yeah.
yeah, you know, he can get it. Unless we stop.
I was going to say, we have a guest for this final talk, and I want to just ask you if you wrap up your answers now, if you would. Thank you.
I'll keep it real short. Brother D said, educate, agitate, and organize. You know, following on what Brother Basir said, there really aren't a whole lot of simple solutions. But one thing you need to keep in mind is that, you know, Marx said that capitalism essentially digs its own grave, and eventually the contradictions become so serious that, you know, it begins to, that you can't keep them contained. And you see that happening with education. The focus, the singular focus on testing, partially because it makes the testing companies a lot of money, has leaked out of the black community, and it's a big deal nationally. It's a big deal in terms of the country's competitiveness, and eventually is going to have to be dealt with on a systematic level. So I would say even on that piece, I think there's a lot of potential for organizing even beyond the black and Latino communities, because it's something that everybody is starting to do. And and I'll shout out one of my students in the back there real quickly, Sister Banu Maat. Raise your hand, sis. Is doing some phenomenal work with the Zulu Nation around hip hop pedagogy and that sort of thing. So I also say that to make sure we understand. There are some youth who are also on the case too, and ready to start fighting and organizing for themselves.
Brothers and sisters, let's hear it for Basir Mchawi and Brother Hank Williams. Dr. Hank Williams. And also, he's half of a dynamic duo. Where's Sister Joyce Jones? Did she leave? Okay, she probably has to go get her show together, huh? Or she's still here in the building?
She should still be here, Ross.
Okay, we really appreciate them. I see Brother Donnie in the back. There's so many people. One of our elders who closed out last week. This week, we have all the way from New Jersey. There's Sister Joyce Jones. Give her a round of applause. So what we have here though now is we have two elders. One junior elder and one senior elder. And this brother's all the way from New Jersey. He's the director of the Africana Studies at Essex County College. And he's a TV host of a program called The Pulse. And he's also an author, a political candidate, and the New Jersey chair of the World African Diasporic Union. And he's the father of four, so he really can speak about education with some authority. Please welcome to the microphone Dr. Akil Kalafani.
What's up, family? How's everybody doing?
Wonderful, beautiful.
Good. First, I want to thank the brothers for the wonderful presentation, and thank Dr. Mack and Sister Betty for hosting this in this lovely space. And Dr. J for his mentorship, and then I ask permission to begin before we do the formal part.
You have my permission.
Thank you. So, it's interesting. I wrote a lot of notes and reflected on some things. I want to start off on a piece, though, that I think that is important, kind of an underlining thing that I gathered from the two of their comments. And one of those is that, when we look at what's going on in the African community, and understand this idea of really this piece that they're talking about is the 3 R's, or African studies or black studies. We have a common core problem there with the people who are the educators in the process, and it's something I call Negro capitulation. That is that where you have Africans who want to capitulate to European sentiments. Right, they want to satisfy Europeans, and so they do everything. Brother Hank talked about it in the way of them wanting to do things, and that this is maybe a place where folks want to come in and present themselves in such a way that that they're slumming around in African studies in the process to getting someplace else. That they're presenting themselves as someone who is really committed to the ideas of Pan-Africanism and Africana studies, taking African things to the next level. But they haven't, at their core, done the main thing he said, and that is that they haven't seen African studies as fundamental to the fundamental underpinnings of what they're talking about. And we see them lurking around at some of my institution. And they talk about things in ways that present themselves as very African-centered, but when you listen to what they really have to say, what they really are saying is that they're trying to capitulate to European sentiment. And we have a master sister who helped us to understand why they do that. And if you go back and read Marimba Ani's book, Urugu, you begin to see a little bit about how they try to fit themselves in to this European idea, because she gives you this understanding of a European, an African-centered analysis of European epistemology and ontology. And when you think about those things, we begin to really undermine and see the underpinnings of what Europeans are coming to us about, and that these Africans who want to dance around in this space that they now present themselves as something that they're really not. They say they're committed to African studies, but really sometimes they have a thing rather they're committed to, right? So sometimes maybe to women's studies, sometimes maybe to Muslim studies, sometimes maybe to an aspect of African studies. But the whole thing, they're not committed to, because they don't understand it. They don't take a holistic approach and analysis to it. And so I want you to think about that from that perspective, because I think that that's a key point. The other one I wanted to mention is that when you look back, Brother Basir mentioned the 3 R's, and he added the 4th one to it. But I want us to think about, at the beginning of that there's a problem, especially when we start talking about to our children and we want them to be educated about something, is that there aren't 3 R's. There's only 1. And he added another, so really only have 2. So we get folks to think about the things even from a flawed beginning, right? Writing doesn't start with an R. Arithmetic doesn't start with an R. But the fundamental, I'm telling the babies, they're teaching them, and they tell them the 3 R's. Well, what is that they're really telling them? They're telling them that what you think you see, you don't see. See, that's what happened with Rodney King. We watched the videos, and we saw Rodney, I was in Los Angeles at the time, we saw the videos of somebody getting beat, but they told us that he was resisting arrest. Now, there was 30 cops there, and then they told us that he was in, this is back in 1992, or before 92, because the rebellion was in 92. They told us that he was driving 120 miles an hour in a Hyundai. Come on now, maybe today a Hyundai might go 120 miles an hour. But back then we knew that if you press the gas too much on a Hyundai, at 70 it might explode. So even to be told that, we know that the things that we're being told are misinformation, but we suck it in and we absorb it, and we think that, and we present it as if it's the real deal. When are we going to question whether or not the things that are presented as the real deal we know are fake? We know is misinformation. And I think the 2 brothers gave us the understanding that we have to see that there is a crisis, and that the crises that we see is not the crisis that someone is telling us that we see, but that we have to reinterpret it for ourselves. We have to analyze it for ourselves. How is it that we're seeing this crisis? How is it that we're articulating this crisis? How is it that we're transforming the crisis and coming up with solutions to the crisis? The crisis in African studies, and someone who's been in African studies, I've run the Africana Institute now for almost 10 years. And hooking up with brothers and sisters, we have all these islands. There's no connection even between the Africana Studies departments. So one of the things that I'm going to work on for next year is to bring the directors of these Africana Studies programs on the East Coast together so that we can begin to think about the community piece even on that level. Right? How do we not have a community of directors? There's somebody at this campus, somebody at that campus. We all doing our own things. Many of us doing good work. Some of us not doing good work, but involved in Negro capitulation. You gotta make sure I get my terms right. Involved in Negro capitulation because we want to be the only one there. We want to be the king on the castle. We want to dance around and show our tail feathers in such a ways that I say that we need to do stuff like an elephant. Like an elephant has this thing, wherever it takes a step, it leaves a mark. But lots of us like to walk around like peacocks. And when a peacock goes around, it's beautiful when it puts its plume up. But when it's resting and walking, it rubs its tail around and you don't know where it went. There's no footprints to be left behind. We need to have the footprints that come behind us that walk like giants, like this house we're in. This is a giant footprint. This is a footprint of an elephant. So therefore, the elephant's footprint, no matter if you try to wipe away, you can't wipe it away because it's here to stay long. whether the elephant walks hard or soft. And so that we need to come in walking like elephants. We need to come in understanding that, the gap that he talked about is partially there because we don't understand that the gap is global. Right? We don't understand that not only is the gap global, but that our understanding of education has to be global. And that it was global in the beginning, though. See, that's the failure, is that we haven't connected to that which it came from. When we look at where it came from, we understand that it was global from the beginning. And I think that's what his comment was trying to get us to understand, is that if we understand that even commerce, right? He talked a little bit about, Brother Hank talked a little bit about economics even, and we looked at commerce. Commerce was always global. If you want to see it, all you do is look at pottery around the world. Right? When you look at that, you say, oh, the economy was global. They talked about Garvey. The economy was global. Everything has always been moving around, but they trick you into thinking that today the economy is becoming global because it's fast and they have full control over it. See, before the internet, they didn't have full control over stuff. They didn't know where you were. You could be on a boat going somewhere. Nobody knew where you were at. They didn't have any controls over things. They didn't have satellites way back then. So they didn't know who was where what. That's why they thought what? That the world was what? It was flat. Come on. Africans have been circumnavigating the world for thousands of years, but they thought it was flat. So that tells us something about where we've come. It tells us that we have missed something. They mentioned that it was a regression, that we've had a regression in our own standing. He said that when he was in school, Brother Basir said when he was in school, that there was a lot of folks in schools, but now there's fewer folks in those same schools. So what is it that's needed? I'm arguing to you what's needed is that the base of what they're talking about is that the infusing of African understanding of things from the very beginning has to be comprehensive, and that in finding and identifying the ideas of Negro capitulation, that is, when we see that folks are capitulating, that they're genuflecting to European ideas of being and doing, that they then themselves are making a dance that we don't want to dance to. They are trying to get us to understand that the dance is about how Europeans do, and if you know Europeans dance, that means you off beat. Right? You don't have rhythm. So we're dancing to a song, but we look like popcorn. So we want to get back to what we need to do. So I think the solution that they're suggesting to us is that we have to get back to something. They mentioned the whole thing about local control and how the school systems are going, but nobody mentioned the fact that the other day, the governor talked about taking over the school in the state in New York City. I was listening to WBAI, and the governor said, well, maybe even what the mayor is talking about is not even worthy. Maybe we should come in, we need to have state control of New York City, just like in Newark, right? And so Newark has been fighting the battle to get back local control for 20-something years. What are y'all really in for, right? Is that yet a trick? To think that what you should be fighting for is to fight the mayor and not pay attention to the governor? What's the real trick that's being played here? We always have to, if you've never seen the video, has anybody ever seen the video called The Dancing Bear? I suggest all of you go home and watch it. It's on YouTube. It's called The Dancing Bear. And it's a video that has you look at some guys passing a basketball, and that when you get to it and you see it, it's not what you think it is. And so something is happening in front of your eyes that you're looking for that you don't see. And so the question is, how much stuff is going on in front of us that we don't see? How much stuff do we think we see that we don't see that is directing us in places that really is not what the real deal is? Go look up The Dancing Bear, and you'll begin to see that the things that you think you're seeing is that they got another trick for you. Every time something opens the door, just like Cuba, what's the trick there? Right? What's the real plan going on there? We think we see what's going on and we're happy about it, but what's the plan? What are they really trying to do with Cuba? Is this really a trick to get in there and get sister? Right? What's the real deal? We have got to understand the plan behind the plan. Right? Because every time we know, Brother Basir mentioned the idea of what do you call it? COINTELPRO, of a conspiracy theory. But because of COINTELPRO, we know there's no conspiracy theory. This is conspiracy. And so we need to identify and call a spade a spade. And so when we see it, we just got to figure out what aspect of a conspiracy is it that's being presented. Because they mix the two, right? They tell you half of it's the truth and half of it's the lie. And then you don't know which half is the truth and which half is the lie. Because they tell you the one is the opposite of the other. And so then we end up dancing again. And we go back to what? Negro capitulation. We capitulating. We give up our authority, our autonomy, our voice, our agency to other folks. We've got to stop giving up our agency to other folks, because as long as they have control over your voice, control over your ideas and ways of thinking, and you think that you are in control, then what you think you're doing, you're not doing anything. We end up regressing. And so therefore, how many, during the turn of the century, when that is in the 1900s, when there were more senators and senators and elected officials in office than there are today, more regression, right? Every time we think we're moving forward, we're regressing. So therefore, we have to have a plan behind the plan. See, we're so committed to telling everybody what our plan is that we have no plan when we know they're going to attack us. That's just like the school. We had the school, Adelaide L. Sanford. I was the chairman of the board of directors. And we knew they were going to come in, but we didn't develop a plan quick enough to plan for the plan that they were going to try to undermine us. And so therefore they did. They undermined us. And so now today, that edifice that we had, 60,000 square foot building, is back in European hands. Right? So we have to have a plan, even here for this building. What's the plan? Because you know at some point in time, if they get a little beside themselves and this becomes a point or an issue for them, then they come for it. Oh, you didn't clean off your sidewalk. You got a broken window over there. Your taxes are late. But see, taxes late for them is, oh, okay, you get an extension. Taxes late for us means we come take the building. Right? We have to have a plan to deal with all those things. And if we're looking at education and looking at the two, there is no two, right? Because in the end, that Africana Studies, or the 3 R's, is that the fundamental piece, and they both said it already, and that is that you have got to have, in everything you do, has to be African-centered and African-focused. That to having the edifices on the wall, when we go into African Studies places, most of them don't look like African Studies places. You think you any place else on campus. And my question is, if you're an African Studies place, when you come into my office, you'll see that everything there looks just like this. And you say, oh, okay, well, this must be an African Studies place. I say, yeah, it's African Studies. What am I supposed to be dressed up in a suit and tie? I got a suit and tie, but that's not what I'm wearing here, because it's not that I'm representing me. I'm representing something that represents someone else that represents something else, right? And that something else goes back to the foundations of where of our people come from, so that I have to pull it from there and bring it forward. And so that we also have to know, the last piece of this that I want to say is that we've got to tie back in our spirituality. Right? What is the African fundamental spiritual connection that helps us to make the connection, to know that we have tools to fight white supremacy, tools to fight Negro capitulation? That is because we know that we're going to have African folks who are going to team up with the enemy, and sometimes I don't even think they know they're teaming up with the enemy. They think they're trying to succeed. They think they're trying to become Oprah. They think they're trying to become Kobe Bryant. They think they're trying to become Michael Jordan. And in the process, they undermine our existence. They do things to help the Europeans and other folks, whoever they may be, undermine the very existence of African people. And so the fact that they want to literally wipe things out, wipe your story, and and I'll stop here, and because this is the latest example of what they've already done to us, and now they're telling you they're going to really do it another way. And that is that if you look at the destruction of the artifacts by ISIS, right? Even that name is funny, right? But if you look at their destruction of those artifacts, all you have to do is go back and say, oh, okay, this is what happened in Kemet. Yes. Right? This is what's happening in Kemet. Because do you know that sometimes the so-called architects and the people who are restoring them, that they change the way they look? They changed the complexion of some of the folks there. They changed the features some all in the idea of that they're maintaining our historical identity. No, they're not interested in that. But they're showing you, and this is just a broad way of doing it, that when they destroy, when they let you know and they're advertising that they're destroying these artifacts, that's telling you that, once again, there's a story behind the story. We're going to put this up front, and y'all going to be all caught up in it, all nervous and dancing about it, shaking in your boots. But you don't see the real deal got going on over here. We need to be we need our own investigative team to figure out what's going on. We need our own secret team who's going to be doing our secret investigations, so that we can come back and know those who are the leaders in the community, the real leaders, not the Uncle Toms, the real leaders in the community who go and address things and helping us to understand how we're going to plan to get forward. Then we have the information to know what it is that's going on that's undermining us or has the potential to undermine us down the road. And then collectively we come together and we do what we have to do. And sometimes our stuff needs to be masked. So we have this over here, and folks think this is what we're doing, and just like they got another program, we got another program. And then that's how we move forward collectively in such a way that transforms our reality. So I ran for office, but I'm running for office in two different places in New Jersey, but the point is that the bottom line is I'm a Pan-Africanist. So that whatever I do in the end is for African people. And it's not that I'm looking to undermine anybody else or that I have this disdain for anybody else, but that we have to get into places strategically so that we can get in the place of power to transform the reality of what's going on. And that's both in the education institutions, that's in primary, secondary, and higher ed, and in the political realm. And so we need to say, find out some young folks in here, okay, you're going to be the lawyer, you're going to be the doctor, so that we're moving forward in a way that we have all the things that we need in place to transform the reality of our community. Otherwise, we're going to continue to go down the road we're going, and it's not looking pretty. Thank you.
I'm watching from on high, and I'm just enjoying it.
Yes,
Dr. J has a big smile on his face up there. Could I ask for one thing before we leave? I'd like to take a community picture of everybody that's here today with our two speakers before we leave. A still photograph. People are okay with that? Yes, okay. Sir. But right now, though, to close us out, is going to be the father of the Board for the Education of People of African Ancestry, worldwide Pan-Africanist, Dr. Leonard Jeffries.
Let's give Dr. Mack an acknowledgement and a round of applause. For the work and let's not forget that us black men can't do it without our women. Let's give Betty, our sister Betty, the team member. Well, I have a shit-eating grin on my face. I mean, I have a smile on my face because this has been, you know how cold and nasty it is outside? But to be in here, even with the temperature, not what it should be, but to see the spark that's coming out of these brothers, how they're presenting this formula that Dr. Mack came up with. And so that, for me, you know, my master teacher was also the teacher of Dr. Mack, Dr. John Henry Clarke. And when you see in front of us the scholar warriors on this podium, it represents generations of resistance and struggle. And at the center of the image that you see in front of you is Dr. John Henry Clarke. And this year we're celebrating his 100th year. So we need to dedicate what we want to do in terms of education and what should be done about education to his memory and also to the lessons he taught us. First and foremost, education is about struggle. Education is about building your families, your community, your nation. And so Dr. Clarke had a particular understanding, and he led the fight for the African worldview. And so we're indebted to Dr. Clarke, and we've dedicated this house to this whole understanding that we can't understand the world unless we have an African worldview. And so he raised it up around the world. But he had a partner who was interested in the African worldview and has a world phylogenetic understanding. He was born in Ethiopia, raised in the Caribbean, and then found his base here in Harlem. And that's Dr. Ben. So Dr. Ben said, yes, the worldview is important, but it can't mean what it should mean to you unless that worldview zeroes in on the Nile Valley. And it's the Nile Valley that will open up so much that you need to have an understanding of, that will let that worldview mean something to you. That we're global people. As my wife says, we're the parent people. And once you get into the Nile Valley, you'll see that even the Greeks that the Europeans worship sat at the feet of the Africans.
Right.
And so you've got to flip the script. We're worshiping white supremacy. And so it doesn't mean any difference whether you're white supremacy at the highest level, that's Columbia University, or at the people's level, that's a city college. And so I'm trying to figure out, one of my works that I should put in place is the tale of two institutions. One in Morningside Heights and one in Harlem Heights. And nobody has had more experience in both those institutions over the last 50 years than yours truly. And so when we're talking about education, you have the European perspective on education. Education is not supposed to be for the masses. The masses are not supposed to have any education. Education is supposed to be for the rulers. And the rulers are trained in special institutions. Columbia University was one of those special institutions. And to try to copy Columbia University, they came up with the academy. Columbia goes back to the 1600s. The academy goes back, and that's the academy that became City College, and the City University Academy goes back, what, to 1847. So that's when the waves of immigrants were coming in. You had to give them a little bit of something to function in society. But they were not supposed to be educated. They were supposed to be trained. The education was going to the elite. And so that's why we had to have a systems understanding. Now in that process of training poor white folks and then training elite white folks to rule, there's nothing for us there. That we don't come into the equation. However, emerging out of the dynamic of America comes Negroes. And then some Negroes find a comfort zone. And some Negroes are, what did you say?
Negro capitulation.
Negro capitulation. Now, we can take that concept, some of you need to write it down. Brother was taking notes. Write that Negro capitulation. Because many of the things that we will continue to talk about relate to that. Okay? The difficulties that Dr. Mack might have in his employment because he raised certain issues have to do with Negro capitulation. The difficulties that Sister Betty might have in trying to educate people in Queens and put up institutions that serve our people come with Negro capitulation. The difficulties that we had at City College in New York, you may think that it has to do with Jewish power claiming a stake in reference to black folk. But you have to have Negro capitulation in it to understand that the president of the City College of New York, who helped black people more than ever, is the only Jewish president that they had, Robert Marshak. The president who did more to undercut the black development that we had for 40 years are the Negro capitulators, the male capitulators, the female capitulators, the mulatto capitulators, the gay capitulators. We got to get deep into this thing. The difficulties that we had with the beautiful sisters in Newark who produced an amazing child development center, charter school, large community center, multi-million-dollar project. Internally, there was Negro capitulation dressed up as an African that produced the destruction of the strongest thing that we had. We had Adelaide Sanford as the symbol. We had Dr. Clarke as where we need to go. We had Ross and Jeffries doing the curriculum. We had the rest of us there guarding, and Negro capitulation cut the strength out of that process. We had 40 years to develop what we developed at City College. And Negro capitulation helped to wipe it out. That's a story that I would have to figure out with you whether we should really put it out there for the world to see, to understand. And what is it all about? That you own this, the wealth and the power and the appropriation of education is put in educating elites, not educating the masses. And if America doesn't have the high credentials in terms of grading now, it's because you put all of America into the process. America's elites are doing as well as anybody else's elites. But Singapore had a plan. Malaysia had a plan. Korea had a plan. Japan had a plan to educate for nation building, to educate for economics, to educate for politics, to educate for culture. And their elites are being trained that way. Most of America is not being trained that way because it is people of color or poor white folks. So there's an explanation for this process. So y'all don't need to get me excited. We done had a fantastic presentation by these brothers. Now, but you need to see the generations. In other words, in this imagery, you see the generations of a Dr. Clarke, a Dr. Ben. Dr. Ben is now 97. You see a Professor Scobie. All of them were born between 1915 and 1918. And then there was a generation that sat at their feet, was inspired by that, went into these high-level educational schools, got the elite education of white folks, but knew that that wasn't good enough for the struggle of black people. And so we got the community education, the people's education. I have what I call my $1 million white boy education from Columbia, from these other schools I went to, including Europe. But what makes me allow me to come here and appreciate what you all are doing, is my African education, the multi-billion-dollar African education that began not in schools, it began in the mind of my mother, in the mind of my grandfather, and they put it in the home. So socialization and acculturation is the key to education, and it begins in the home. So we make a mistake to think that we can come up with a formula to fit into the white process and create a charter school, and fit into the white process and create a community school, or as Brother Basir was trying to create school for the young men. But we're in the white system, and we're not taking enough precaution to understand that they will undercut anything we do because they want to maintain white supremacy at all costs. So systems analysis becomes key, and the interrelationship of the generations. So in this photo, you have the Dr. Clarke, the Dr. Ben, the Professor Scobie, then you have the Len Jeffries, who comes in with the generation of the Asa Hees, the J. Carruthers, the Marimba Anis, and Basir is a part of that generation. And then you have Professor Smalls, who was one of our students. He was a student when I got into City College. And so Dr. Mack says that there's no winners in these debates. There are no losers in these debates, they're just winners. But I would say we want to enhance the winners of the younger generation. So Brother Basir has a track record, and he has been educated in the African way with the East and Jitawayusi and all of that education that came up out of Brooklyn. But Brother Hank has not had that. He's had to deal with the Negro capitulators and people trying to fake it and whatnot. So even though Basir is my partner and we're struggling for the same thing, I had to give a special kudo to Brother Hank for being that generation that represents the future. And so he's one of my prize students, and I'm trying to see whether I can weave him into the foundation in a way that, even though he's got 1,500 things to do, and I think the only way we can get him involved if we take his partner in. So we may have to take both of them into the foundation, and then we can have some glue. Now, I've been in New York for 40, 50 years, got married here, married a beautiful queen from Harlem, but my roots are in New Jersey. So in order for me to deal with this education thing that's been my life, and to deal with the African component of it, I have to maintain a link with my roots. And so while we were sitting here, I squeezed over to Dr. Calfani before he gets sick. I said, I know you got 1,500 things to do, brother, but I need you as the second vice president of the foundation. Now, what was he gonna say? I said, but, and after he made this presentation, did you see me in his presentation? I could see him dealing and dealing. He's the closest thing to me that has come up out of Jersey. Let's give him an So, but he's got to pay the price, but he already knows. If you're going to be African, you're going to pay a price. And you think it's the white boys that's going to come at you, but it's the Negro capitulators. Brother Smalls and I can name the people at City College, which we'll never do. We'll have a session here and let you all know about it, but it will never go out to the public. They were in every discipline. They were in the English department. They were in the School of Education. They were in the administration. They were women. They were men. They were straight. They were gay. That story we don't want to tell. You all think it's the white folks, and it was those damn Jews. But we want you to keep thinking that, because they run the master system. But to keep the master system going, you can't have a plantation economy, a plantation system, a plantation culture, unless there are Negro capitulators. There are 5 white folks on a plantation. Thomas Jefferson, his white lady, the one handling the money for Thomas Jefferson, the one handling certain of the management of the personnel. But there's 400 of us. There's 400 of us. They can't eat without us preparing the food. We could grind up glass in the food and they would be just loving it. You see, we raise their children.
Right.
You could have pillow death. You know, the pillow death, after they got some of that black milk, then the pillow just spilled over. We take care of their elderly. That old son was so-and-so. She was there for 80 years beating up on black people. And so we send her on to glory. Thank you. The system could only maintain itself if they didn't prepare Negro capitulators to run it. The same thing with these cities. You've got millions of black people in these cities. How come we can't run New York? How come we need people to come back out of the suburbs to run New York? Because they haven't prepared us educationally to take our destiny in our hands and put the skills in our hands. Or if you put them in our hands, the consciousness is not there. Let me use one example. Coming here, I was trying to get here, but I had to clean off the walk, I had to do a whole lot of other things. I had to try to find some ice. There's no ice melt, etc. However, I wanted to see this Negro. This Negro is one of the most brilliant, James, just give me a minute. This Negro is one of the most brilliant black people on the planet. His hands are magic. He's a surgeon, a brain surgeon. Ben Carson, Dr. Ben Carson, MD. But the Negro capitulation in him says, I gotta be up there with the white boys
Really?
and run for the candidate of the presidency. He's been programmed and processed. You can't take his brilliance away from him because he's demonstrated it. But how can you be up there with Ron Paul, with all these other fools, Cruz, and now who else has jumped out there? The Walker, Jeb Bush. Here's this black brilliant man who doesn't have an African consciousness, so he becomes a Negro capitulator. This thing is too heavy to believe. However, we're on a victorious path. We're born to win, but we're programmed to lose. We're born to win, now we have to educate to win. And that means we have to sit down and come up with an educational plan. We can do it here. You know, Brother Basir has enough experience in the education to come up with a working paper that we can work on. And then Hank can interact with that. Dr. Mack can add his. Betty is the supreme educator. Regent Sanford can come in here not just to sit and be ceremonial. She can look at a working paper of a plan to educate black folk. And not just in the schools, started in the homes. You got to have a program to educate the women, the elders. We have to take control of the socialization process of our people. So I'm very happy about the turn of events. I walked in here and I said, well, am I in the wrong week that Brother D was carrying on again. And he's one of the students that came in from a family foundation, a community foundation. He came in to be educated, but also to be a part of the struggle. And he's still on the pin. Brother D, you've got to be getting old. When are you going to show some of this? I can't believe it. At any rate, it's about the family. It's about the education of the family. It's about the victory. Black studies, and Dr. Mack says we got to get home. The struggle for black studies has been so successful that we unveiled the real truth and turned history upside right. That we're the African origin of humankind, African evolution of society, African cradle of civilization in the river valleys. That all has been established now by our scholarship tapping into this knowledge. However, they're not going to let us implement it. We got to come up with a strategy on how you implement it, putting it in the homes, the churches, on the ball fields, in the playgrounds, in the community, and then also struggling to keep it into these regular institutionalized structures. So, you know, this was a good day for me. In spite of all that cold outside, I thought Dr. Mack would cancel it, and Betty would cancel it. But a couple of weeks ago, Betty said, we don't cancel. So I got my black ass in here because I knew you don't want to be here.